turn now to the head of programs at Clean Fight, which is running a program, the Empire Technology Prize, to encourage the development and adoption of centralized high-temperature heat pumps for tall buildings. So, great segue earlier. Thatcher, can you give us a bit of background on the Clean Fight and the Empire Technology Prize?
I do own another jacket. That's sort of disturbing. Sure. So, and Nick is in the back. So, and to start with, I have 3 colleagues here who didn't tell me they were going to be here. So, because of that, they have to get called out. So, Nick, who's standing in the back now, and Ashika, who's right here, you have to raise your hand, are working in our food program. So, if anything I say about that gets you interested, you should definitely grab them after. And Julia, sitting right next to Ashika, is working on the Empire Technology Prize. So the Clean Fight, we're a nonprofit. We're funded by the federal government, DOE, and EDA, and NYC, state government, which is, I think, supposed to be my lane on the panel, the state. And indeed, most of our programs have been focused on New York State. NYC has been quite generous, as well as Wells Fargo. And recently, very recently, we're able to say Breakthrough Energy and Builder's Vision. So we exist to try to accelerate the adoption of clean energy solutions. The mission is 100% clean energy for 100% of the population as soon as possible. We think, and we're not alone in this thought, that a lot of the solutions we need to decarbonize a lot of sectors of the economy exist already, they're just not widely adopted. And so we run programs, we also provide grant awards to try to encourage speedier adoption. Generally, our programs involve, as I said earlier, would-be adopters, so these are potential customers of clean energy technologies and providers of those technologies. I probably know less than just about everyone in the room about refrigerants, so I'll contribute what I can to the conversation. Most of that, as you've already heard, will probably be about our experience in seeing from a practical perspective what it takes to adopt some of these low-GWP refrigerants and other clean energy technologies. Empire Tech Prize, just briefly, the Empire Technology Prize is a $10 million prize that we have designed in concert with RMI. This one is funded by NYC and Wells Fargo, to try to encourage the development of solutions to decarbonize space heating in tall buildings in New York. Turns out, and I'll talk more about this later, that there aren't great solutions if you want to do that with a drop-in replacement for a boiler today. And so the prize is meant to encourage the development and adoption of those kinds of solutions. We have 7 finalists in the prize. 6 of them provide heat pumps. 1 has an external building shell solution, which we can talk about. One of the finalists is represented here in the room. I'm just calling people out all over the place. Ambient Enterprises is here in the back. So definitely chat with them if you're interested in learning more about at least one of the solutions that's made it into the finals. It's a year-long prize. We'll pick a winner for the grand prize in September of next year. So stay tuned for that. That's the thumbnail. Happy to talk more about it, but is people thinking?
Sure. There was a statistic that I think I read that you posted. The greenhouse, buildings are responsible for, I think, 40% of the greenhouse gases of New York City and 30% for the entire state of New York. Is that correct?
So the numbers that we kind of have settled on after looking at it are that, so globally, and this is true of New York State, something like 1/3 of emissions can be attributed to buildings. In New York City, it's more like 70%.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a lot. And what have you learned in developing and now running the prize that this audience should know?
Yeah. So that's a good start. Just appreciating the role that kind of buildings, particularly in urban environments, play. This audience, probably a lot of you are aware of that already. What we learned, some of the things that we learned along the way that are relevant, of the building emissions in New York, something like 30% of those come from space heating. And New York, like certain other cold climate cities, in New York, a lot of the tall buildings and buildings in general, but we focus on tall buildings because they're particularly intransigent with respect to decarbonization. About 70% of tall buildings in New York are steam heated. And a lot of the rest are high temperature hot water. Again, not unique, but this is unusual compared to certain parts of the world. So we looked into that kind of reality further and realized that if you want to decarbonize your space heating today and you're one of those buildings, your choice really is to rip and replace, as many of you may know, your entire HVAC system, including distribution terminal units, and put in a low temperature hot water heat pump, because there's not a drop-in replacement for that steam boiler today, which I mentioned before. And so that drove the design of the prize, got us to focus on trying to help OEMs from around the world understand the opportunity that exists in cold climate cities like New York to create a unit that could be a drop-in replacement for those boilers. We found there are boilers there are heat pumps that can sort of do this today, but either they don't necessarily have the right refrigerants, so they're higher GWP refrigerants. That was the GWP of the refrigerants is a consideration, it was a consideration in selecting the finalists, will be in selecting the winner in the prize. And I'll come back to that in a second. We did find, there are heat pumps that can produce steam mostly in industrial processes and mostly not quite yet with the refrigerants that we want to see in general and in New York in particular, given the regulatory scheme, although that's still being settled. And so we designed the prize, we reached out to a lot of OEMs, we were fortunate to get a bunch of applications, and we have selected these 7. We did find also in selecting them by involving the would-be customers. So we have a bunch of what we call demonstration partners. They represent some of the largest real estate owner-operators in New York and beyond. Tishman Speyer, L&M, you can look on our website, a host of others. We did find that, even without our prompting, they also are interested, as we were talking about before, in lower GWP refrigerants. So even though that was one of many criteria that we used as we kind of evaluated, as we got their input, even unsolicited, many of them were talking about, lower GWP sounds great, we'd be interested in trying it. And in the same breath, almost, they're saying, yes, CO2, which a couple of the finalists use as refrigerant, sounds really great. We're going to have to retrain a lot of people. Or helium, which is another one of our finalists, right? And so this goes back to the kind of training, education that we talked about. So that's another learning, or 2 there. One, sophisticated owner-operators are already thinking about this, are excited about lower GWP alternatives, but it's not easy, even if there's a drop-in replacement solution that uses a refrigerant like that to convince the market that it's ready, right? So that's a little bit more about ETP, a little bit more about a couple of the things that we learned, but I'm sure we'll get to more.
Sure, so we're back to adoption again. The tech prize focuses on adoption because of the, I shouldn't say uniqueness of the way buildings are heated, but in New York, there's a specific problem. And so the adoption aspect of what they're doing was core to their success, as criteria from the very beginning. I'm wondering, how well do you believe we consider practical adoption in the US at the federal, state, and local level when it comes to mitigating superpolluting refrigerants? And do you have ideas about how to do that? That we haven't talked about yet.
Go ahead.
So I think beyond what we've talked about so far, I'd just share, as we were designing the rules for the prize, one of the things that we're talking about was, okay, what should the limits be with respect to we ended up focusing on 20-year GWP for the refrigerants. And we wanted, because it's, we're focused on New York to start with, to just refer folks to the relevant regulations. Turns out those are in flux. They were in flux as we were designing them. They're still actually in flux today, although there's more clarity on where they're probably going. As it turns out, 5 of the 6 heat pumps are using ultra low GWP refrigerants, so we ended up in a great spot. But I think from going to the kind of practical considerations, I think New York as a jurisdiction, as a state, has been really forward-thinking with the CLCPA. New York City has been pretty forward-thinking with Local 197, which we can talk more about. But clarity, as soon as possible, is as important, in my view, as sort of getting the regulations exactly right? So I spent a lot of time with startups in my career. There's an adage there, right? Don't let perfect be the enemy of great. And I am concerned that from a practical perspective, we're in some cases letting the perfect be the enemy of the great.
I think one thing that we haven't really discussed too much is ease of installation from a customer perspective, right? I think that's really apparent if you look at New York City, for example, right? Like, I live in a high-rise building, which I don't get to fill anything up. And, hopefully soon my building managers will get to changing how my building is heated and cooled, but it needs to be pretty darn easy for them to do that, to minimize disruptions to me, the tenant, right? And that's a very common story across buildings generally, thinking about heat pumps, speaking about retrofits, thinking about when you change things in a building, you ideally want to disrupt as little as possible. You want to make that installation pretty easy. We at BNF, we have our own little prize. It's called BNF Pioneers. It's an annual climate tech competition. Wasn't focused on refrigerants, sorry. But we did have a buildings challenge. And one of the winners that we picked, we liked them because they, oh gosh, why am I blanking on the name of the company? They have a cozy, which is to go over
Kelvin.
Thank you. To go over the steam radiators, very easy installation for significant energy efficiency improvements. That's the sort of innovations that we actually want to see more of in the building spaces. How do we make the ease of installation improve over time as well? Because as we've already alluded to, the cost argument can be hard to make sometimes, but ease of installation can help soften that as well. If it's at least easy to install, then people can see more of a benefit. Exactly.
I would echo everything that you just said, and also a second plug for Cullen, who was in our first program. But that's also one of the motivators behind the Empire Tech Prize is if you're gonna at some point see an end of life of your boiler. I mean, right now it's sort of anxiety provoking that right now there are boilers coming to the end of life that are being replaced by other boilers that have a 20, 30-year life, right? And so if we can just sort of provide an alternative that would be a drop-in replacement, in theory, that should be a much easier install than, the low temperature heat pump as we were talking about before, the whole distribution system. I will say, in getting the OEMs involved as finalists in the prize, one of the things that we did, kind of when we announced those finalists, they were all in town. Some of the demonstration partners at Tornado took them to their buildings, to Stephanie's point, and this is the boiler room, this is where your product needs to go, right? And there's some folks from New York, but there are folks from the Nordics and other parts of the world, and that kind of practical reality, to your point, I think is really important for kind of solution providers to understand.
Yeah, I'll just add 2 thoughts. One is in the strategic sort of sourcing arena in purchasing. You're often doing analytics on a whole purchase category, and then you're saying to yourself, what big contracts are coming up and when is the right moment to intervene? Because especially when I was looking at federal purchasing, you know, some of those contracts are in place for many, many years, and they're extremely difficult to change after the fact. But if you can look ahead and say, okay, this one's up for renewal, and that's going to have this impact and that, so there's sort of moments in time when you want to be ready to start to put interventions in and have the language and have the things ready. At the same time, have the dialogue with their industry suppliers so that they know it's coming, so they're not blindsided, so they get ready for it and they can effectively compete. So there's work on that front. I would say the other work that is also rather pragmatic, but not on a building by building level, perhaps, but is it in green leases and in the negotiation as a tenant for a better environmentally performing building. And so this is more for larger scale than individuals, but there's a lot of things that you can negotiate up front. It's much harder to do after the fact. So again, it's sort of about being quite strategic about when you try to use these levers, and being ready with the language and being ready with the understanding of the technology and what's feasible and what time frame and so on.
Thank you. So, no, I can ask you a question. The Department of Energy recently launched the Commercial Building Heat Pump Accelerator